He's the leader of the bunch, you know him well, and he's finally back to kick some tail. It's the Donkey Kong Trilogy. I kind of misspoke earlier. Calling this loose collection of games a trilogy is a bit of a stretch. While the games feature most of the same characters, they don't really share much else. Donkey Kong introduced the idea of platforming as a genre, being the first game where jumping was an integral technique for movement. Donkey Kong Jr. flipped the ideas of Donkey Kong on its head, having players do a lot more climbing rather than running, and putting an emphasis on vertical rather than horizontal movement. Donkey Kong 3 didn't really fit in anywhere. It was the black donkey of the trio, so to speak. Its main mechanic was shooting. In order to make this section as cohesive as possible, I'm first going to go into each of these separately, and then assess the impact of all three together. So let's start at the beginning. Donkey Kong first came out in arcades in July of 1981, the result of the first president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, and his incompetence. Nintendo of America was a relatively new subsidiary at the time, and Arakawa was chosen to lead it due to the fact that he married the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi's daughter. Arakawa had no prior experience in business as far as I can gather. He graduated from Kyoto University with a degree in civil engineering and later got a master's in the subject at MIT. It seems to me that he was in the right place at the right time. He spoke English, married the president's daughter, and lived in Vancouver, Canada. I guess this was enough qualification to reward him the position of president of a multi-million-dollar company attempting to establish themselves overseas. In 1981, he decided to order 3,000 machines of radar scope, an arcade cabinet that did quite well in Japan, for distribution in America. It ended up a critical failure in the States, only selling 1,000 copies. Nintendo of America was in trouble. Arakawa poured nearly their entire budget into these cabinets. Luckily, he got bailed out by Yamauchi, who sent him conversion kits and a brand new concept developed by Shigeru Miyamoto, a relatively new Nintendo employee. This concept was none other than Donkey Kong. There had been a general evolution in complexity during the arcade era of video games. What started with only vertical movement in Pong turned into horizontal movement with an action button in Galaga and Space Invaders. This later evolved to four-way movement with Pac-Man, leaving the perfect opportunity for a new concept to take over. At the time Donkey Kong hit arcades, Pac-Man had been out for a year. Miyamoto's creation retained the four-way joystick that made Pac-Man intuitive, but added a single button that allowed the player to jump, and so started the genre of platformer. Donkey Kong featured 4 unique screens, making it the most fleshed-out arcade cabinet at the time. When a player completed a level in Space Invaders, everything would respawn on the same screen, but the enemies would move faster. The same can be said with Pac-Man. These games lacked any type of story or variation to keep players engaged for long periods of time. Donkey Kong's level got progressively more complex, from the 25-meter stage's diagonal bars to the daunting 75-meter stage's bouncing springs and moving platforms. The story isn't much to write home about. Mario's pet gorilla escapes and steals his girlfriend, Pauline, climbing a construction site. Mario then decides to rescue her, ascending the obstacle course. But the small cutscenes that played in between levels gave players something to aim for when getting to the top of the screen. Donkey Kong was actually the earliest instance of a game's story unfolding on-screen. While many other games had stories as key components, they were described in the manual or perhaps on the arcade's marquee. The reward of a new environment and a new story beat was more motivation than had previously existed to continue onwards. It's no surprise that Donkey Kong sold exceedingly well. It was such a massive success that, according to Masayaki Uemura, one of the chief developers of the Famicom and NES, it sparked former President Yamauchi's interest in developing a home console. The primary goal of the Famicom was to play a perfect game of Donkey Kong, an obvious choice for a launch title. Of course, this wasn't the only reason the Famicom was developed. There was bound to be a decline in Game & Watch handheld sales, and Yamauchi knew it, but capitalizing on Donkey Kong's success was certainly one major reason for developing the console as soon as possible. The Famicom and NES port of the game is, all things considered, quite good. there were some minor differences involving item placement and sound design. The scaling had to be changed, as Donkey Kong would be displayed on a smaller, less vertically oriented screen. This didn't alter too much, but it did mean that hammers in certain levels were placed in different locations. The effects sounded slightly different between versions due to the fact that the arcade version used analog circuits, while the NES used a sound chip. However, a number of more sizable changes were implemented in order to save space on the NES carts, which is where the bulk of the differences lie. These ranged from removing the transitional "how high can you get" screens and blue barrels in the first stage to all but the final cutscene disappearing. In addition, the infamous cement or pie factory level was completely dropped. This could be because of spatial restrictions within the cart, but it's also possible that the NES wasn't capable of displaying so many on-screen sprites to allow for smooth movement within the stage. The cement, fireballs, conveyor belts, and items may have been too much for the NES to handle at the time without sacrificing gameplay quality, but there's no way for us to know for sure. The NES Black Box version did actually add a key component: the title theme, composed by Yukio Kaneoka. This little tune would go on to be quite influential in its own right, but I'll get into that more later. Let's venture back to the arcade. A sequel to Donkey Kong was all but required. It was then that Nintendo made an interesting decision. Rather than keeping the same formula that worked so well with Donkey Kong, adding a few new levels and perhaps involving some new story beats, they decided to completely rework the characters, environment, and gameplay of the original. This aversion to iteration is something Nintendo has done with many of its sequels. See Super Mario Bros. 2, which shifted the focus of combat from jumping to throwing, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, which changed the open-world 3D environment of the first game to a 2D platformer, and so on. Donkey Kong Jr., as the second game in the franchise would be named, started this trend. Released in June of 1982, nearly a year after its predecessor, Donkey Kong Jr. was its own self-contained experience. Instead of playing as Mario, players would control Donkey Kong Jr., the son of the previous game's antagonist. In a twist nobody saw coming, Mario was now the game's villain. After the events of the first game, Donkey Kong was captured by Mario and caged. Donkey Kong Jr., sad that he won't be with his father, takes it upon himself to retrieve the key from the abusive owner, who can be seen attempting to whip Donkey Kong in the arcade version's ending, and save the day. This may be the first video game to ever feature a shift between the original and sequel's character lineup, having the player go up against the previous game's protagonist. This storytelling technique is usually quite dramatic. The player's familiarity with Mario, a man they got to know so well over the past year, had disintegrated. Their trust was broken. But, rather than dwelling on the loss of a good man, players would have to rise up to put an end to the mustachioed man's antics. Genuinely, I applaud Nintendo for taking such a unique approach to the sequel from the narrative lens. Similar to Donkey Kong Jr.'s arcade version plays several fun intro cutscenes involving an extremely sad-looking young ape. These, once again, act as the motivation for completing levels. While scoring high certainly did matter, Donkey Kong Jr.'s focus on story only served to further push the player to question why they were motivated to reach a high score, and that's pretty much where the similarities end. Donkey Kong Jr.'s gameplay flips the platformer of Donkey Kong on its head. While Donkey Kong focused heavily on horizontal movement in the form of running and jumping, Donkey Kong Jr. focused on vertical movement in the form of climbing. Donkey Kong Jr. was, after all, a gorilla. Gorillas are known to be fantastic climbers, but not so great on the ground. Thus, all the game's levels were designed with this in mind, featuring a multitude of climbable vines throughout. The first couple of levels do feature a fair amount of running and jumping in the beginning portions, likely to help ease players into the transition of mechanics from Donkey Kong. After that, though, it's off to the races, or rather, the speed climbing championships. Other than Level 3's horizontal running and jumping sections intersected with climbing, the game drops this movement nearly entirely. Climbing actually gives Donkey Kong Jr. more room to experiment than Donkey Kong had with its running and jumping. Mario could also climb ladders, but only up and down. Donkey Kong Jr., on the other hand, is able to alter his speed of ascension and descension depending on if he grabs one or two vines. If he climbs up using only one vine, he proceeds slowly and cautiously. However, on descent, he slides like a fireman. Using two vines to ascend doubles Junior's speed, but halves it upon descent. Each of these movements come with their own risks. For instance, it may be painstakingly slow to climb upwards on only one vine, but it also shrinks Junior's weak spots, making it an ideal method of climbing when multiple enemies are coming from above. The intuitiveness of the mechanics lends to their ease of learning, but the many situations presented in the game means that it's difficult to master. Donkey Kong Jr.'s NES port also didn't have many differences from the arcade version. Again, the sounds are different, and there were some adjustments that had to be made in regards to the screen resolution. All but the final cutscene were removed, meaning we didn't get to see a very sad DK Jr. flying over the ocean with an umbrella. Also, the final cutscene was actually altered. In the arcade version, Mario runs after DK and his son, presumably trying to whip them, but ends up getting booted away. On the other hand, in the NES version, he just falls to his death. I have no clue why this was changed. You'd think Nintendo would be as family-friendly as possible, but I guess this was their one exception. Rip to Mario. While Donkey Kong Jr. didn't sell as well as Donkey Kong in both arcades and on the NES, it feels like it aged better, according to the standards set by a post-Super Mario Bros. World. The original's fixed jump physics became very obviously outdated by the time 1985 rolled around, but Donkey Kong Jr.'s climbing didn't get an overhaul in the same way. Now, you may be wondering, where does Donkey Kong 3 fit into this picture? Spoiler, it doesn't really fit at all. It's clear that Nintendo didn't want to simply reproduce the material of earlier titles and re-release them as sequels, but we've kind of covered the most important aspects of a platformer in running, jumping, and climbing. Where could Donkey Kong 3 possibly go to break even more new ground? The first of many major differences between DK3 and its predecessors was that of character selection. When Donkey Kong 3 came out in September of 1983, Mario had already found plumbing work with his newly created brother, Luigi, in Mario Bros. So he was replaced with Stanley, an exterminator who first appeared in the Game & Watch game, Greenhouse. Mario's iconic design was missing from a series that so prominently featured him in all of the other games, replaced with somebody that just kinda looked like a nondescript dude. Donkey Kong is back to his role as primary antagonist, but he seems to have been shoehorned in. There's no opening cutscene, nor is there a cohesive story of any kind. Donkey Kong climbs down into Stanley's greenhouse, hitting beehives and trying to retrieve flowers. Why could Donkey Kong possibly want to do this? I have no clue, and it doesn't seem like the game knows either. It's not like Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr. have awe-inspiring stories, but at least they were told through cutscenes interspersed between levels, serving as motivation for the player to move forward. Donkey Kong 3 completely drops this and replaces it with nothing. There are only 3 levels in Donkey Kong 3 as opposed to the 4 included in the previous entries. This may not seem all that significant, but it did cut 25% of the content. Stages in DK3 are determined by how quickly the player can push Donkey Kong off of the screen, which in some cases may be nearly instant. If Stanley picks up the Super Sprayer, it may only take a few shots to send DK on his way, ending the level in literally a few seconds. Speaking of, the gameplay of DK3 is half platformer, half shooter. While Stanley can move around and jump in order to push Donkey Kong up and out of the greenhouse, the play area is confined to 3 platforms on the bottom third of the screen. Similar to how Stanley's appearance pays homage to the Game & Watch games, the shooting aspect takes from Nintendo's Space Firebird, a Galaga clone that was first launched in 1980. The controls and physics certainly functioned better than its predecessor, but shooters had been on their way out for years. The decision to round out the trilogy with such a strange break from the Donkey Kong formula is an odd one to say the least. This, combined with the fact that the game was released in arcades during the video game crash of 1983, translated to its relative obscurity and poor sales figures when compared to its peers. The NES version of Donkey Kong 3 removed several animations, including Donkey Kong's expression when getting shot and the ending cutscenes. Notably, when Stanley dies in the arcade version, he gets swarmed with bees that seem to eat him. In the NES version, though, he just keels over. This could have been removed due to censorship, or because of data limitations. And that's pretty much it. It's not like there was a lot for Donkey Kong 3 to adapt for a home console release. It's pretty clear that Nintendo was running out of ideas on what to do with Donkey Kong by the time DK3 came out. The series saw a decline in sales and popularity by 1983, but at this point, Nintendo had moved on. This isn't to say that Nintendo simply dropped their most popular IP. Donkey Kong has gotten more re-releases than any other game in the entire black box set, ensuring that the original is always playable. Right after the black box releases of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. ceased, the two games were released in 1988 on a compilation card called Donkey Kong Classics. In 1994, Donkey Kong for the Game Boy came out, featuring the original 4 levels and then adding a whopping 97 additional stages. These levels didn't just stick to Donkey Kong 1's mechanics. They featured sections requiring Mario to pick up and throw items, similar to Super Mario Bros. 2, climbing heavy features, like from Donkey Kong Jr., puzzle platforming, new jump types, and more. It's a fantastically underappreciated game that goes well beyond the original. Emulations for Donkey Kong, up until recently, were of the NES version and not the original arcade release. This means that they have continued to omit the Cement Factory level for whatever reason. The one exception to this was in Donkey Kong 64, where, in the game, a 100% faithful emulation of the original arcade release can be found. Other re-releases of the NES version were made available on the Game Boy Advance, both in e-reader packs and as a standalone title, Animal Crossing for the GameCube, the NES Classic console, and on every eShop ever made by Nintendo. The Switch's eShop finally brought the arcade version into the modern era, releasing the arcade and NES editions separately from each other in 2018. Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong 3 both had e-reader card packs as well, along with subsequent releases on all of Nintendo's eShops. While I cannot attribute the NES port of DK to the advent of the platformer genre, there are a few things I can directly attribute to it. The return of Donkey Kong was supposed to be Donkey Kong's next break on the NES. It was mentioned in the official Nintendo Player's Guide and Nintendo Fun Club Issue 5, but pictures of the game have never surfaced, and it's unknown if it even made it past the conceptual stage. The next installment in the Donkey Kong franchise would be on the Super Nintendo with Donkey Kong Country, developed by Rare and published by Nintendo. Finally, Donkey Kong had something to do. He was no longer tied down by Mario. He was free to be his own gorilla. The game didn't function at all similarly to the NES version, but it's likely that DK's continued success led Nintendo to revisit his likeness when searching for new concepts to work off of. The tune at the beginning of Donkey Kong is actually used as the introductory music in Donkey Kong Country. Kanaoka's iconic opening theme was one part of a lengthy career at Nintendo. He ended up working as a sound programmer for a sizable chunk of black box games, including everything in the arcade series. He also went on to compose the NES Sports Series jingle, all of the music for tennis and baseball, and much more. Kanaoka mentored some of the most famous video game composers of all time, including Hirokazu Tanaka, who worked on too many games to count, and Koji Kondo, the man who composed the Super Mario Bros. And Legend of Zelda themes, among many, many others. Video game sound design isn't focused on nearly enough, and while Kanaoka might not be as well known as his contemporaries, his work deserves its own praise. Donkey Kong Jr., while arguably more fun than its predecessor, didn't break from the platformer genre enough to warrant its own individual impact. It did spark the trend of Nintendo games sequels not simply improving, but rather innovating on their previous entries, but that can be attributed to the arcade version more than the NES's port. Donkey Kong Jr. the character was actually used more than Donkey Kong himself, at least until DK Country came out. Jr. was a playable character in Super Mario Kart for the Super Nintendo, Mario's Tennis for the Virtual Boy, and Mario Tennis for the N64. This is likely because of his father's prior roles as a primary antagonist. Until the adult DK got his own game, he wouldn't truly be a part of the combined Mario universe. Now, fully grown Donkey Kong is like a cool uncle. He shows up in Mario Party, gives you a star, and leaves. He replaced his son in Mario sports titles, or rather, according to fan theories, DK Jr. grew up and turned into the new DK, which doesn't really make sense seeing that Mario Tennis came out after Donkey Kong Country, but honestly, who really cares? Donkey Kong 3 marked the end of the road for Stanley. Out of every black box game I've talked about thus far, it may legitimately have the least tangible impact. I could not find anything that the game did that's even remotely noteworthy. It wasn't included in any DK compilations for a reason. It just wasn't good. Maybe its significance lies in its lack of significance? Actually, no, that's just giving it too much credit. And that's it, the original Donkey Kong trilogy and its impact. This section might be the longest yet, but there was quite a bit to cover. Donkey Kong is one of Nintendo's pinnacle franchises, characters, and games. I hope I did this part justice. Honestly, it would drive me bananas if I didn't.
Help Donkey Kong Jr. save his papa on your ColecoVision, Atari 2600 VCS, or Intellivision video game system.
Game players everywhere, please help me save my papa.